This video is a part of a series created in collaboration with the George C. Marshall International Center about George Catlett Marshall Jr. and his home, Dodona Manor. The George C. Marshall International Center brings to life the timeless values of selfless service and unwavering integrity to develop visionary leaders worldwide. Learn more about Dodona Manor, view upcoming events, and join the mission to preserve Marshall's legacy at georgecmarshall.org.
The appeal of this place was really the outdoors, because Marshall himself liked gardening. He liked to put on his coveralls and go dig in the dirt. So that was the appeal. But on a rainy day, this is the exact place where they would gather.
Was there anywhere specifically you wanted to start at? Or any you said you had a couple quotes or something?
This idea of the experience of studying someone for that long and what the golden nuggets are of having studied him for that long. And then, if it would be okay, I would like to mention what Truman had to say about who he was and what there was to say about him at the time of his death.
You can start wherever you want.
Okay.
Whatever point you want to start with.
All right. Let me know.
Right now, if you want to.
Go?
Yep. Okay. Whatever. Just like, I don't have introductions or anything.
Okay. Well, I'm delighted to be here to talk about General George C. Marshall, or we could say Secretary of State Marshall, or many other titles that he held. But I've studied Marshall for a very long time here at Dodona. Our docents might say that, well, Rachel has been studying George C. Marshall since the last century, and that's actually true. So it's almost an odd thing to spend that much time with one person and their effect in history. As an American history teacher, at the time I was a teacher, we used to say Columbus to the Mekong Delta. And by the way, history teachers have to go a lot farther than the Mekong Delta these days. But to concentrate on this particular person and the history that surrounded that particular person has been an interesting journey and a rich journey that was not framed by needing to tell the entire story of American history. So as a retired American history teacher, it was a unique opportunity. So sometimes when I talk to rising juniors and seniors in high school about Marshall, and I want to say something that's very succinct, I refer to something that President Harry Truman had to say about him at the time of Marshall's death in 1959 at his funeral service. And he said this, he said, General Marshall was an honorable man, a truthful man, and a man of ability. And then he says, honor has no modifying adjectives. A man has it or he hasn't. General Marshall had it. And then he says, truth has no qualifying words to be attached to it. A man tells the truth or he doesn't. And Marshall was the exemplification of a man of truth. And then he finishes by saying that ability can be qualified. Some of us have a little of it, some of us have moderate ability, and some men have it to the extreme. General Marshall was a man of great ability, so he was a man of honor, a man of truth, and a man of greatest ability. So if we let all of that study of this individual sift down to some core thing, that pretty well covers it. And oftentimes when we study history, even when we study about leaders who do great things, if we study deeply, we find an oops, we find a disappointment in who they were. And although Marshall is by no means a perfect man, and we don't present him that way, if you study him deeply, you will come away with this sense that he was a man of excellent character, a man of integrity, a man of truth. You might not always like his truth, but he was going to tell you what he felt was true. And I've read lots of opinions about Marshall in terms of what were his gifts, what made him special from any other general who went to the Pentagon, to the war offices, or to the Pentagon with this briefcase. And may I give you two examples? Forrest Pogue wrote a 4-volume biography of Marshall. And he said, Marshall's genius lay in his ability to combine an immense talent for organizing global military and diplomatic operations with a unique sense of how such organization had to be accomplished in a democracy. And that is just a huge element of Marshall's strengths. And there's a background for that. May I tell you what that is? When Marshall was a young officer in World War I, he imagined that as a young officer, you are going to a global war. We're talking about the United States of America and our fortress America and how we were going to stay out of European troubles. But here we find ourselves in a global war. And Marshall learned a great deal about how to move armies, how to deal with supply, 1,000 lessons that were extremely important because they had to do with whether or not individuals, including soldiers, survived that particular war. And when that war was over, General John J. Pershing, who was in charge of the American Expeditionary Forces in World War I, he tapped Marshall to become his aide-de-camp. And Pershing came back from World War I as the U.S. Army Chief of Staff. And at that time, they were working on an Army reorganization bill. And Marshall helped Pershing with the testimony for all of that discussion. He worked with senators, congressmen, the President of the United States. And this is a young man who's very young in terms of this kind of exposure. He's 40 years old, and he is working at the very top of this government. But he came to understand through that experience exactly what the military can do, given the fact that we are a democratic republic, and that decisions, even about the military, and perhaps especially about the military, are directed by people who are elected by the citizenry. And a lot of people don't understand that at all. And they see the military as their turf, and I get to do whatever I want, and after all, I'm a soldier, and I'm going to help win battles, all of that. And Marshall certainly wanted to do that, but he always understood that there's this construct. And I used to tell my students that he had an excellent U.S. government teacher, because that teacher taught him that as a military person, you can make your case before that Congress, and you can make your case before that president. But in the end, it is those people. It is that those people are the ones who are ultimately going to make the decision about what you are allowed to do. And in this country particularly, we are fearful of large standing armies to begin with. And so that experience of being with Pershing at the end of World War I was really formative for him, I think. And so it wasn't just that he was a good organizer, that he could organize global military and diplomatic operations, but it was how that could be accomplished within a democracy. And then imagine, we are then in World War I, we were more an association than an alliance with the British and the French. But in World War II, we formed this Anglo-American alliance, and we had a formidable ally in the Soviet Union. So we're not only talking about interacting with congressmen and senators and even presidents, but we are talking about being on an international stage, and we're talking about a second global war in 20 years. And we are talking about making decisions that will affect, in our case, the lives of as many as 8.2 million young men who have been called to serve. So imagine the understanding, the brokering that had to be done to determine issues of strategy. And in those wars, both World War I and both World War II, and for that matter, any war, there is the problem of scarcity. There's never enough of what is needed. And so, therefore, he is not only operating in a democratic environment, but he is operating in this international environment, and it involves people like Winston Churchill, not to mention Franklin Delano Roosevelt, who had his own desires about how things should go in that operation. And then let's add Stalin and Chiang Kai-shek. So understanding how systems worked in something as serious as a global war was something that Marshall understood, not that he always liked it and not that he was always satisfied with how it came out, but it was something that he was able, it was an environment that he could handle and that he did handle.
Yeah. One of the things that you sent me when you sent the little amount of really good information that you sent over, one of the lines there was, Marshall was very much shaped by his upbringing. He had a rather demanding father who loved his son but was ambitious for him, a mother whose guidance was gentle but effective, and an older brother who seemed to be a golden child. Is that how that kind of shaped Marshall during the early years?
I really think so, especially the contrast between his mother and his father, because his father could be very stern and demanding, and he loved his son deeply, don't get me wrong, but he wanted him to succeed. We all want our children to succeed. So in some cases, his father's method was to be tough with his mother. And Marshall says that his mother was one of the most important influences of his life. When he did something he wasn't supposed to do, he almost confessed it to his mother, and his mother essentially told him, you don't want to do that again. And that contrast was huge. And then playing in the background, you have this older brother. I sometimes call him the golden child, where everyone thinks, oh my goodness, that brother Stuart is doing extremely well, and why isn't George a little more like him? There is a little bit of that expectation when you read about their childhood. And and yet, and we always tell this story of how Marshall overheard his brother Stuart saying to his mother, you know, you don't, because Stuart had gone to VMI and had accomplished great things academically and in every other way at VMI. And he's telling his mother, you cannot let George go to VMI because he will ruin the family's reputation. And Marshall says, right then and there, I decided I was going to wipe his face. And it's a wonderful statement, because that sense that somehow his brother didn't think he was okay to accomplish what he had accomplished at VMI set him on a particular course. And then when he goes to VMI, he takes to that kind of military structure. And even though he was kind of a squirrely kid, and maybe his brother recognized that, the fact is that VMI sort of brought him into focus. And it became the beginning of what would be a very successful military life. And when we talk about the formative influences of young people, because again, we discuss that with juniors and seniors in high school a lot, oftentimes there is some catalyst, something that sets that person on a path. And for Marshall, it was VMI. And one of the things he says about VMI, which I found very interesting, is he says, you know, he becomes the first captain in his fourth year at VMI. He is the first captain. He holds the highest rank of anybody at that military institution. And he says, if I had not had that role, maybe I would have been as slack as I could be. But I did have that role, and I understood that something was expected of me, that I had to figure out a solution to whatever problem arose. And sometimes problems did arise, even in a VMI setting where you're basically managing cadets. And I always find that interesting, where he says, okay, if I hadn't been the first captain, maybe I would have been as slack as I could be. But in this role, I knew I had a responsibility. And he says, I knew I had to make decisions that would not end with the resentment of the people that I led, which I also thought was an interesting comment on his part in looking back on VMI.
So between his mother and the Virginia Military Institute, how would you define responsibility?
His responsibility?
Or how would you define, like, in terms of, because Marshall was, it's almost like the ownership of actions, like taking ownership of what happened and being able to communicate that with other people. And that's both the responsibility that he did with his mother, but also at VMI. So how would you define responsibility?
I think he understood that there were expectations in roles that he held. Well, starting out at VMI as first captain, that with title came responsibility. And also that a portion of that responsibility had to do with needing to act. Marshall was not a hand-wringer. You know, it wasn't like, oh, this is too hard. Imagine the challenges that were put before him. And yet, in each case, he felt he had to make a decision because he held that position of leadership, even in extremely imperfect circumstances. Going back to his mother, I think a part of, and he always talks about her as a formative person in his life. Oddly, he doesn't name his dad, names his mother. And I think that had to do with that gentle manner in which she taught him right from wrong in a very essential way. By the way, he was also reared in the Episcopal Church. He was christened in that church, and he went to church all of his young adult life and into his old age, for that matter. And there were these certain key ideas that were taught even in that church setting. There was a very interesting gentleman, a reverend at this St. Peter's Episcopal Church in Uniontown, that Marshall names, with his mother, he names this individual as an important factor in his development. And this man's name was John Whiteman, Reverend John Whiteman. Now, the story is so interesting to me because, you know, as I mentioned, George Marshall, as a kid, is kind of a squirrely little guy. He's got all kinds of projects going. He can get into a certain amount of trouble. And this Reverend John Whiteman was a young minister who'd come to that Episcopal church. It was very interesting because Marshall said that the minister who had been there before was an elderly man who had kind of died on the job. And this young Reverend Whiteman comes to be the Episcopal minister. It's interesting also to me that Marshall says that the town, the people who went to the Episcopal church, it's like they kind of wouldn't give him a fair shake. You know, he's like, okay, he's the young minister. And Marshall strikes up a friendship with this young reverend, and they go on hikes, and he takes him around to some of the historic sites, as Marshall's dad took Marshall around to historic sites, and Marshall was very interested in that. But Whiteman sees something in this boy that eventually bears fruit. And however he was shaping that young boy, it was hitting its mark. So that many years later, Marshall is saying, the Reverend Whiteman in Uniontown was an important influence in my life.
Did Marshall have a lot of have a good ability to know when to be patient and know when to take action?
Well, oftentimes he had to wait to accomplish what he wanted to accomplish and what he believed in. For example, from the beginning of World War II, Marshall believed that a cross-channel invasion to destroy the German army was the strategy that should be pursued. But because of the circumstances of supply, the circumstances of building an American army, the influence of Churchill in terms of strategy.
Need some water?
Thank you. Marshall had to wait several years, really, before that was accomplished, even though he believed that. And the War Plans Division also believed that, by the way, that a cross-channel invasion, not these peripheral side attacks, was the strategic way to go. But, boy, he did not get that. And eventually he made compromises that helped him understand the stakeholders. You know, nowadays we talk about stakeholders, and that there were other aspects of strategy that were driving decisions for North Africa or up the Italian boot that had to be put in place before this cross-channel invasion could take place. And he accepted that and made course corrections, even though that piece, that idea that we don't take real estate, we take armies, was still such a big part of his thinking. And he made all kinds of compromises that were required. And some people, I heard somebody say, oh, well, Marshall is very uncompromising. Well, that's just simply not so. He had to make all kinds of compromises in dealing with these various stakeholders in 12 conferences of that war, where you are talking about two formidable enemies, and the stakes are extremely high.
Did you want to drink some water? Or anything?
Yeah, thank you.
And is it all right if you put the paper down just because the rustling? I don't
sorry.
know. I don't know how much of that gets on. Also, I also notice that when people use their hands more, they usually are like articulate better. So it's like it was just one little thing.
Okay.
I don't think it's a major problem.
And that second quote, did I mention the second quote about Marshall's abilities, special gifts and abilities?
From Truman?
Not so much from Truman, but what was it about Marshall's abilities that was different than, say, other generals? And that a lot of his abilities lay in that experience with General Pershing at the end of the war in Washington. But also, there was another writer, Lance Morrow, who had had a military career himself. He wrote an article about Marshall in Smithsonian Magazine in 1997, and he said he possessed an extraordinary intellect, an astounding memory, and what might be called a kinetic military imagination, a genius for seeing the dynamic interaction of facts in rapid motion through time. And so if we look at what were maybe almost like a gift, Marshall's ability to see not only the big picture, but the moving picture was really important to what he was able to accomplish in overall strategy, because for all practical purposes in World War II particularly, Marshall he's a desk warrior. And yet this ability to see how armies work across time and across space was almost a gift for him. And it was important.
Yeah. So just having like taking the military aspect of it out, just a kinetic imagination would be just having an imagination that is not focused on what could be, but rather what is, and then working with that current reality that you have.
Yeah, and he does that constantly, and he is required to do it constantly. But I was talking with a group of military leaders the other day, and we were mentioning a Civil War general, George B. McClellan. And, it is said McClellan he was like central casting for a general, even the way he looked. If you were going to make a movie about a general of the Civil War, you would choose him. And he could get that army. He could get those brass buttons polished. He could get them in rank order.
But he never got
But
anything done.
he could never move it. And I validated this by looking it up because I thought, well, surely not. But that general, that Abraham Lincoln did write him a telegram to say, if you are not going to use the army, may I borrow it? And that is the exact opposite of Marshall. So a very famous set of plans that Marshall produced was in World War I in the Meuse-Argonne Offensive, where you had to move French soldiers in, this group of French soldiers out, American troops in here. You had to deal with 90,000 horses. Just try to wrap your head around 90,000 horses, okay? And yet again, it was just, and by the way, you had to do this under the dark of night. You had to move these troops under the dark of night or on trains that were being shot at by the enemy. And so it's interesting what he says because it just sounds like a truism. But he said, I thought the best way to begin was to commence. But it's very important. It's hard. You've got a hard job. But somehow you have to sit down and do something about it. And yet, this was a young officer of World War I, and he put together this plan that ultimately was a series of offensives that was going to bring the Germans to the point of surrender. Now, that doesn't mean that it was a nice, neat, and tidy Saint-Mihiel Meuse-Argonne offensive. It was not. But in the end, the basic concept of it worked. And that was that idea of being able to imagine how an army moves through time. But a larger idea about that kinetic military imagination was this larger understanding of systems. Yeah. And that is just played out over and over again. So Marshall was able to not get him. Nowadays, we would say, people get themselves into silos where they see only their channel and none other. And Marshall saw the relationship between these different pieces. For example, when he is at not Fort Leavenworth, but Fort Benning, he's training these young officers. And he's telling them, listen, you're going to be dealing with fast-moving planes and tanks and armies that are going to be in situations far from ideal. What's going to happen to you is that you are going to be leading young men that have been asked to go to battle for you and for your country. And this is a very real thing, because when he first got to Fort Benning, these trainers, for example, it was almost like they were phoning it in, as if they did not realize what is the other side of that training. And that is the young soldier that he worked with when he worked with the Civilian Conservation Corps in the 1930s, this young recruit, this young draftee. So in looking at systems, he never saw this training officers over here as an abstraction. He saw that as being related to this young man over here who's left his home, his job, his family, and he's being asked to sacrifice his life if necessary. So it's not like this is over here in one silo and these boys are over here in another. It was, there is a connection here. And he always saw that connection.
How would you define a system?
A system is something overarching that you can bring efficient action to. When Marshall was Secretary of State, sometimes we talk about Marshall as the architect of the European Recovery Program. We call it the Marshall Plan. But when Marshall got to the State Department, and again, looking at organizational systems, even when he's in the Army as a general, he's looking at how the Army is organized and how you can become a more efficient Army. So he gets to the State Department. He's had a lot of experiences that bring him to be the Secretary of State, even though he had been a career soldier. He had been in many varied scenes of power. But one of the things that he noticed when he got to the State Department was that all of these entities, there was the Latin American group, and there was the European group, and there was the Asian group within the State Department. And they were all in their little kingdoms, their little fiefdoms. And all of them wanted to talk to Marshall. And Marshall saw, first of all, we need to have somebody at the top who filters this information and this need and these questions through, because I cannot be the person who answers every question about this organization. So that was one piece of it that was important. But when he started looking at what shall we do about what has happened to the Europeans because of this global war, which was his task, he says, first of all, he that practical sense of groups of people across time and space. He understood, okay, we in the United States, we like to talk about democratic institutions and market economies. But he says the people in Europe are not interested in institutions of any kind if they do not know how they're going to feed their children at night. So there was that idea that was systemic, that idea that there are these basic needs for all human beings and that you cannot accomplish certain things if you just ignore that kind of reality for people, especially looking at Europe at the end of World War II. And then secondly, he said, you have to have a group of people who can think about how to solve problems. So he founded, or he created, what came to be known as the policy planning staff at State. As far as I know, I'm almost certain that it still exists. But the idea was that somebody had to have a piece of time and a role that allowed them to think about solutions. And in fact, this group that was put together in that first policy planning staff was made up primarily of economists at the State Department or Soviet specialists. Knowledge that these are the issues that are going to be tough. And George McKinnon, he called George McKinnon, the brilliant George McKinnon, who was also a Soviet expert, over from the War Department, and he put him to work heading up this policy planning staff, and he gave him 2 weeks to create a plan for the reconstruction of Europe. It took McKinnon, Kennan, not McKinnon, but Kennan, 3. It took Kennan 3. But that group of thinkers were able to outline what became the skeleton of that plan. And that is the plan that was the first output of the policy planning staff, was the plan for the Marshall Plan. So Marshall, did he sit down? I mean, when I first came here to Dodona, people wanted to picture him in there in his little office writing out the Marshall Plan. No. And yet, he was extremely influential in how it all came out because of this broad systemic understanding of how groups work.
How did Marshall compare to like the other generals like Patton, Bradley, MacArthur, Eisenhower? How did he, I mean, obviously Marshall was the chief of staff of the army, chief of staff of the army or chief of staff? No, just the army of the army. So how did he be able to manage? Because I know Patton had his own personality, MacArthur had his own personality. Yeah. How did Marshall be able to, one, be able to manage all those people, but also be able to keep them in check?
It was something that he managed. And it's interesting because Patton is a good example because, of course, he had this unique personality that we all have heard about. And MacArthur. And if you think about wartime and scarcity, you think about a MacArthur out in the Pacific. You think about Marshall managing a Europe first victory before the main thrust of the United States military power could be invested in the Pacific. And you think about MacArthur out there wanting the help that he wasn't getting enough of. And Marshall, first he understood that, but he was able to stay the course for the strategic view that you could not let Hitler rove over Europe for 3 or 4 years while you tried to vanquish the Japanese in the Pacific. And yet MacArthur was pushing on Marshall constantly. And everybody understood why, And yet Marshall could handle the likes of a MacArthur and his demands. And he respected MacArthur, too. He respected his generalship. But he had to manage him. And he allowed MacArthur to be MacArthur, and he allowed Patton to be Patton, as long as it did not subvert the dominant paradigm of strategy for this war. And for MacArthur, as much as Marshall recognized that MacArthur had legitimate needs out in the Pacific, that this overarching peace had to be respected, and in due time, help would come. And a good example, by the way, of how he managed these generals, and Patton is a prime example, is that Eisenhower, of course, Patton is under Eisenhower, and there's a situation where there's a slapping incident with these soldiers who are supposedly, suffering mental breakdowns because of the vicissitudes of war. And you know how all that went, and it's very famously depicted in the movie Patton. And then Patton makes these, quote, indiscreet remarks in England that get him in a great deal of trouble. And Eisenhower is telling Marshall that Patton has broken loose again. And Marshall basically tells Eisenhower, you are in command of this operation that you're planning. And he says, I will respect. It's your decision. You're the one that's going to need to work with him. And I will respect your decision about it. And I will handle kind of the politics of it on this side. The one thing he says in this letter, this telegram back to Eisenhower, is that Patton has had tank experience. He mentions that, and he leaves it strictly up to Eisenhower. And basically, Eisenhower writes a letter to Patton and tells him, if you do this again, you're out of here. It was that idea. But he did not move Patton home, for example, which could have been a possibility given the fallout from this. But Marshall gives him permission, mentions something that might be salient, and leaves it there. So, I think that he understood that many generals have big personalities, and that's just fine. You do not have to be anything like me. But if it interferes with the big picture, then that can be a different matter.
So Marshall was really good at forgiveness with room for redemption.
Yeah, you don't see him. I don't see him holding grudges. Is that what you mean?
I think so, yeah.
It's business. It's business. It's the job. And these jobs are hard. And he supports these the challenges that these generals have, whether it's MacArthur in the Philippines or whether it's Eisenhower getting ready for this Allied Normandy invasion. But it's business. We need to win this war. And we're working on how to do that. And that is the main issue.
You have to get something done, but also know that people are human and that they're going to make mistakes. And that while like there's a certain line that doesn't get crossed, it's like still having enough room for uncertain circumstances.
One of the things, for example, that Marshall did was just before the Allied invasion of Normandy date, he brought Ike back to Washington for, I don't know, a week, because he could see that Eisenhower was really getting frayed. You know, his communications with Marshall indicated, listen, he's just stretched to the limit. And Eisenhower had enormous responsibility. And so he says, nope, I want you to come back and talk with the president and see your wife and have some time to relax. And of course, Eisenhower said, oh, no, I can't possibly do that.
Was this around the time Eisenhower was the supreme commander of the Allied forces?
Oh, absolutely. We're talking about March, and June is D-Day. We're that close. Yeah. So you can imagine Eisenhower saying, oh, no, I can't do that. And Marshall says, yes, you can do that. So, he gets him a room at the Greenbrier Resort, and he meets with Roosevelt, and he has this week where he gets off the scene. And that Marshall understood that was an important thing. And there are other examples where he notices that this general is getting overly stressed and takes very kind of subtle action to ease that a little bit. And he always recognized that when you are on a battlefront, you are under enormous stress because the stakes are so high for you. Just imagine Eisenhower on the morning of June 6th deciding, looking at the clouds, the kind of aluminum trailer that he's in is like shaking from the wind and the rain. And he's supposed to say, go or don't go. Imagine the pressure of that. And Marshall really appreciated that. Going back to a time when Marshall had to make decisions that had to do with people who had been his friends and the mission. When World War II came, there were a whole series of officers that had been in World War I and had performed very well in World War I. And now we are building an army for what became World War II. And Marshall, he feels that a lot of these officers, high-ranking officers, in this 20-year interim have gotten, they've lost their edge. And he does not feel that they are physically or mentally capable of remaining in a war situation.
Yeah. Is it because they became like complacent or docile?
Sort of.
Both.
Because there's no war going on, and he says they weren't physically well enough or mentally well enough. They had lost their edge. And Marshall said, no officer is willing to say that he's not up to the punch. And so therefore he had what he called a plucking committee and 500 of these officers were retired. Now, Marshall knew a lot of those officers. He had worked with them in World War I or in other assignments, military assignments. And, oh my gosh, there were officers that would never speak to him again. But Marshall, the mission was to build an army with good leadership, and he did not see that they were capable of it. And so, therefore, he did the hard thing. And he says, I think some of them never forgave me. But it did not keep him from saying, well, I'm going to take that one out and leave that one in. It was all based on the idea of, are they capable of serving?
Yeah. So is that what separated Marshall from the rest of the crowd, which is that even between World War I, World War II, during like the peaceful time, I mean, there was a Great Depression and everything, but during that time when there was no war, he still sharpened his mental sword, and he kept keeping that edge up so that when the war did come, he was prepared enough to be able to handle the task of becoming chief of staff the day that Germany invades Poland.
Right.
Yeah.
As he told his successor, you seem to have left me in a war. Yeah, because the experience in the late 1920s at Fort Benning. Keep in mind that Marshall has the experience of World War I in his very fresh memory. And when he gets to Fort Benning, he's training these young officers. And toward the end of World War I, he sees, those 90,000 horses are soon going to be replaced by tanks or jeeps or other vehicles. He sees that this is going to be a mobile army. He sees that you can't use the past war to train for the next war. Somebody said, well, tell me what's going to happen. I don't want to hear what happened in the last war. I want to know what's going to happen in the first 6 weeks of the next war. If anybody understood that, it was Marshall. But again, he's looking at these officers and he's saying, these are the young men who will lead troops in battle, and already things are beginning to heat up again in Europe.
So the past doesn't define the future, but rather it's just a lesson of mistakes that shouldn't happen again.
Right. And he simply said, it's not the war we're going to fight. When we fight another war, we're not going to be in these static trenches. It's going to be a war of movement. And you have to get used to the idea that you're going to move armies quickly and you're going to use machinery to do it. And you're going to go on terrain, maybe on a daily basis, that is unfamiliar to you. It will not be like that last war. But moreover, it's going to be real. And for example, when he was at Fort Benning, he noticed that these training officers, like Fort Benning was a huge complex. I don't know how much it's been reduced now, but I mean, it had thousands of acres. And so this officer who was doing the training, he was going out to exactly the same spot every single time with these young officers in the training exercises. And it was kind of like you had the answers in the back of the book, and they were given everything they needed to accomplish the task. And Marshall says, that's not what happens in a battle. What happens is that you may not even know the terrain that you're in. You may have maps that have whole sections that are not useful to you. And you are going to be there in the dark of night with enemy fire coming at you. That is what you're going to be experiencing. And so even for the trainers, he says, I want you to go to other parts of the reserve to do something different. And just that one thing is just a good example of that. And he tells these young officers that are being trained, they come in and he says, he gives them a blank sheet of paper and he says, now I want you to write down all of the territory that you went across, all where describe your journey to your training spot this morning. And they're thinking, oh, okay. After they said gulp, they did the best they could. But he says you have to be observant. You have to realize that this business of being in a war, a real war, things are in a state of flux. You don't know what you're dealing with, but you have to take the best information that you can gather, and you have to decide something that can determine the fate of those young men that you're leading. And then, and I don't know, it's interesting how the assignments of one's career can shape a person. So he does that Fort Benning thing in the late 20s. He has the experience of a global war. Unbelievable. And now he's training these officers. And then he's working with the Civilian Conservation Corps. That was an amazing assignment for him. And by the way, he loved it. And, that Civilian Conservation Corps, it's a Roosevelt New Deal idea. And he loved that. That was his favorite New Deal program. And why not? I mean, you had these young men, they had no jobs. You think about the Great Depression, 25% of people who wanted a job did not have a job. And a lot of those were like young, single men, roaming the country, riding on freight trains, going down the road, knocking on doors, asking for bread, literally. And so that Civilian Conservation Corps was to get them off of those freight trains, to get them off of those roads, because this idea of these young, restless men posed a possible danger to the Republic, if you will. But, I mean, they came from the city, they came from the country, they'd never had dental care. Many of them were literally hungry. As they said, that the thing about the Civilian Conservation Corps is that you had 3 hots and a cot. But that was amazing. One Civilian Conservation Corps young man, he says, oh my gosh, they brought a platter of pork chops. And you could have as many pork chops as you wanted. So the idea that they were well-nourished, that they were getting good meals, that they had a clean place to sleep, and that they got training. And Marshall saw, look how they improve when you give them basic training. And he understood perfectly that those officers I was training back at Fort Benning, guess what? These are the guys that you're going to be leading if a war comes. And when war did come, 3 million of those young soldiers had been in CCC programs. So it was such a fortuitous set of circumstances for Marshall that working with Pershing at the top, working with these officers in that middle ground, and then working with the very young men who were going to be called to serve, who had no experience militarily, and yet were going to be asked to make this sacrifice. All of those things were incredibly important to Marshall, and he learned from each of those experiences. Sometimes we talk to our students and we say, well, so-and-so learned from his experiences. Well, some leaders don't learn from their experiences at all, actually. And yet, Marshall did. He's always observing. And, for example, at the end of World War II, Marshall saw what happened at the end of World War I with the Treaty of Versailles and the kinds of economic conditions that made it almost impossible for these countries to survive, and also set the stage, really, for World War II. I mean, in a lot of ways, World War II is an extension of the issues of World War I. And, as I said, he said, look at these people, they're starving. And so they're not real interested in democratic institutions. And even the idea, by the way, that Germany would be a part of the Marshall Plan. Now, you have to realize that in the beginning, Germany wasn't Berlin. The whole of Germany was divided into 4 sectors. And so we're talking about the occupied portion until that was no longer the case. But the fact is that Marshall, listening to his policy planning staff economist, understood that you cannot send Germany back to a pre-Bismarck agricultural society. And why is that? Because the German industrial complex is integral to that whole Western European recovery. And can you imagine? I'm sure you understand that the French weren't real happy with Germany. And yet even the French came to understand that to punish Germany is to punish us. And that kind of broad level of really systemic understanding, that was a big old piece of it, that Germany piece. And yet Marshall said you have to create circumstances where free institutions could survive. You have to create circumstances where it's not the task of the United States of America to put a soldier on every street corner in Europe, because we're not able to do that. They have to recover. And that involves Germany. And Germany, the recovery and the appreciation of Germany, by the way, for the Marshall Plan is huge.
Do you want to take a small break just so I can make sure everything stays recorded? I do have one thing I want to go to once we get back.
All right. Do you want to tell me what it is?
Journey over the end result, which ties into the movement being, I was kind of tying in like the life lesson of moving rather than stagnating, of being always having the mindset of being comfortable with change and being always moving. And that's comfort with that chaos. I think there was one movie made in the USSR that it was obviously like Soviet propaganda or something, but the way it was made was really, really good. I never watched it, but...
Well, Hitler, he had this filmmaker who the triumph
of the will.
Yeah.
Yeah. I think
that was one of the most influential films.
Yeah.
I mean, even at the Olympics, the Jesse Owens Olympics, this one woman whose name I can't remember, I haven't conquered her name. I should, because she was a very important filmmaker for Hitler. And I mean, like, she got down under the track, dug a hole so that you could see the runners coming in, things like that, which weren't done at all. But the Frank Capra movies, Marshall said, when the colonial person, the man, he was taught that he uses the term Indian, of course, we wouldn't use that now. The Native American, the indigenous person, comes to his gate, then he takes his weapon from over the mantle and he defends his home, hearth and home. We all get that. A man's home is his castle. But he says, the young man who's going even to Europe, why do I have to fight over here for these people? That they need to understand why they've been asked to do that. So that Why We Fight, the first one that Frank Capra produced, was the Battle of Britain. And by the time you see it, you're ready to take your weapon from over the mantle and head to London. That
was a good movie.
Yeah, it is. I mean, it's just like you see that that red blob or that black blob going over Europe and closing out the light, is very good.
The other one, The Longest Day, that was also a really good movie. That was, because that's mostly on D-Day.
D-Day.
The amount of, because I think like the first 30, 45 minutes of the movie is just them waiting for D-Day. It's not even the event itself. It's just them sitting around waiting for someone to say, all right, time to go.
Go or not go. And to have that machine ready to go and to then, by the way, perhaps say, no, we're not going. Yeah. Talk about Eisenhower having a real decision to make that came right down to him and only him. And by the way, when you watch Saving Private Ryan, you see that opening scene on the beach. And, veterans from D-Day, like in that opening scene in Saving Private Ryan, I mean, these soldiers are crying for their mothers. And the soldiers in these reunions say, soldiers crying for their mothers. And as a mother, to watch that scene, it's just heartbreaking, But again, it gets back to this idea of that really is what you're asked to do. And it's a great old big fat ask, Anyway, don't get me started.
It's all right. So what you said earlier about movement and how Marshall was always trying to be on the move. That he wasn't trying to stagnate. He's trying to sit down and wait for something. He always was moving, even when nothing was happening, he was still moving, still getting stuff done, which is partially journey over the end result, trying just enjoying the journey, but still having that end goal, but also tying it to like personal life. Is there a big difference between being comfortable with stagnation and being comfortable with movement, of always trying to make sure that you're not holding yourself back?
That's a really interesting question where Marshall is concerned, because part of it is being driven by what he's being asked to do as a career soldier. And this one person who is on our board, this General Crawford, when he talks to high schoolers when they come here for this ethics in leadership conference that we have, he tells them, you grow where you're planted. And that was so characteristic of Marshall. And it's linked to a sense of duty. This is the path that has been chosen for me. I'm going to control that path as much as I can. But I have a responsibility, and I just press on.
How would you define duty?
In terms of Marshall, it is a sense of commitment to the United States of America and its military aims. And it's just a very strong, clear sense of responsibility that Marshall has. It's patriotism, but it's not like flag-waving kind of patriotism. It's the idea that you have chosen a military life and that you have been given responsibilities that a government larger than you has told you are to do, and you press on. I mean, he had a kind of, endurance mentality. That doesn't mean that he always loved the assignments that he got. For example, when he got sent to the Illinois National Guard after Fort Benning, he didn't love that assignment, but he took it on. The United States military, and by the way, MacArthur was U.S. Army Chief of Staff at that time, had sent him to Illinois because there was labor unrest, and it was thought that the National Guard units there were not up to some of the labor unrest that might occur, say, in Chicago. And so he didn't love going to the Illinois National Guard, but he took that responsibility on, and in the end, those National Guard units were up to speed.
So duty is doing things that are not only for a higher cause, but just the right thing to do for the responsibilities that you're given.
An acceptance that this is the career I've chosen. In terms of the other positions that he held, then you see this sense of duty over personal preference. I just don't think he could have imagined what would be asked of him after he retired from the military. They were not going to be going fishing in the great Northwest. And even to go to China to try to sort out these warring forces of Mao and Chiang. I mean, this wasn't what he thought he was going to be doing. And one of the people who's working on the ground, this General Wiedemeyer, he tells Marshall in the early days, and I won't be able to set the scene up totally accurately, but basically Wiedemeyer tells him, look, you're not going to be able to do anything about this. And Marshall, has this little flash of temper, and he tells him, we are going to do something about this, and you're going to help me. And it's like, okay, I get it. But that is an interesting example because it was a very thorny task trying to find this peaceful settlement between these two forces. And some would say that he was not successful in making that happen, even though he certainly worked very hard to make it happen. But there was that idea, that scene where Wiedemeyer is being defeatist. And it's like, no. So here Marshall becomes Secretary of State. He steps off the train at Union Station and he goes to be sworn in as Secretary of State. No fishing in the great Northwest, right? And yet, and look at the problems that the State Department had to consider, primarily what to do about Europe and the destruction that has befallen them. And was Marshall expecting to be the Secretary of State? No. But he applies the systems that he found work for him in a military setting. He answers Truman's call to try to do something about the situation in Europe. And he applies what his gifts are in setting up a situation where a plan could be developed that would be effective for that recovery. So again, what does he do? He just presses on.
I know I've heard multiple times that Marshall always reserved his feelings for Katherine. How was his relationship with Katherine? What kind of woman was she?
Very interesting woman. Now, here is where I like to mention his first wife and his second wife, because Lily, whom he met down on the VMI post, right off the VMI post, where he heard her playing a piano, like his mother did, so he was pretty much a goner early on, and she was beautiful, which helped. But, she was kind of a Victorian woman, and she was the perfect wife for him in the early days of his career. Now, you take Katherine. That was a totally different story. First of all, Katherine graduated from Hollins College. In 1902, 6% of anybody graduated from college, and you can believe that most of them weren't women. So we'll start with that. And then she wanted to study Shakespearean theater, and really she wanted to act in Shakespearean theater. And she pursues that. And you have to realize her father is a Baptist minister, which is unbelievable that he allows her and her sister to go to England to study the Shakespearean study. We use the word study here, to study Shakespearean theater. And then she ends up acting for this Benson Company, which would have been an incredibly reputable Shakespearean company in England, and just pursues a career in acting. And eventually, she comes back to the United States and makes a rather conventional marriage to this attorney and has the 3 children. But, oh my gosh, she was an interesting, modern woman. because they got married in 1930. So this work that she was doing in England, we're talking about the 1920s. And yet, I find it interesting and excellent that Marshall, I think, loved both of these women very much. They had successful marriages, and yet they were very different in their personalities. And that idea that I reserve my emotions for my wife, that line that he said that time, the fact is that he was a person who did not display a lot of emotion. I mean, you got what you got, and it wasn't going to be, a lot of chit-chat. He's not going to be talking about who won the Redskins game around the water cooler. That's just not him. And he felt that this kind of formal, straightforward demeanor was important. And so every once in a while, he expressed an emotion. For one thing, he had a bit of a temper that every once in a while got to him. But in terms of how he presented himself to officers, the formality of it was something that he intended to do. And I think he's speaking to that. And I think that he felt that soldiers, that the military who saluted him, they wanted this person who seemed to be in control. And so you don't see too many outbursts. Now, you do see an outburst every once in a while when something is subverting the dominant mission. And that has to do, for example, with the railroad strike in 1944, when the railroad workers go on strike. And Marshall is in a news conference, and the reporter called him white-knuckle angry because, and he he references the fact that Marshall had been Time Man of the Year. He armed the Republic. Yeah, he armed the Republic, and boy, is he mad. And that came back, that emotion came back to that sense of fairness, that we are in a war, a sense of mission. We are in a war. And many of these railroad workers had deferments. And, in certain ways, the economy of the war had moved us out of the Great Depression. They were getting paid better than they'd probably ever been paid, and they go on strike. And the equipment and the soldiers of war were moving on those rail lines.
Does that have to do with, like, in Marshall's perspective, the workers were more self-interested rather than trying to go for what was most important, which is the
war.
War, yeah.
Yeah. There's another example where after the Normandy breakout, where we began to make progress in Europe, there are a lot of people who have been doing, quote, war work, who decide that they're going to leave war work and they're going to get another kind of job because, hey, the war's going to be over and my job's going to dry up and all of that. And Marshall, again, that just infuriated him. And he told his generals in the Pacific, because by that time the war in the Pacific was really in full tilt. And he says, I want photographs to come back that show the sacrifices that are being made by these soldiers in the field. And also, I want photographs that show how the equipment that is being made by American industry, the wartime equipment, whether it's tanks or bazookas or whatever it is, I want pictures that show what that tank did. And he tells reporters, the person who dies on the last day of the war is just as important as the person who dies on the first day of the war. And so there's a piece of it that says, you don't understand the mission here, or you wouldn't be doing this. And then there's a portion of it that says, I have to protect these young men who are being asked to not get a deferment, but put their literal bodies on the line for this country. And so he wasn't too happy about that. So you see emotion, you see true emotion, and why not? But he keeps that temper under control a good bit.
Yeah, so he only had the emotion when it was needed for the task. It wasn't uncontrolled emotion. It was more of emotion to show the passion of the mission.
Especially, we're in a world war. And if you just want to globalize it a little, you can say we're talking about 8 million young men that we've asked to do something. And so it is that mission, winning the war. But it's also, what are you doing as an individual to make that happen? And if you are simply thinking about yourself with no thought for what your action will result in, if you leave that job and now we don't have anybody to do that job, it's not fair. Marshall really did have a scrupulous kind of fairness standard, and it's not fair that you've asked that young man out there in the Pacific, in the jungle, in the incredible heat, to do this, and you want to get another 50 cents per hour for your services on the railroad or, whatever your future job might be.
Yeah. How would you define fairness?
I think especially in his case, it's seeing how you fit into the big picture, and that it sometimes is bigger than your own personal desire. And especially in the heightened emotion and requirements of a wartime situation.
Are there any examples of Marshall dealing with people who didn't have that same sense of selflessness?
In the case, for example, where he retires these officers, the plucking committee, and this one officer tells him, I can't go to Europe. Marshall tells him he's going to Europe. He says, I can't go to Europe. My furniture is going to be delivered tomorrow. He says, my God, man, don't you realize there's a war going on? So that would be, a good example.
You touched on this a few times. Although Marshall always had to deal with a little bit of a short temper, the fact is that he had a great deal of emotional endurance. How would you define emotional endurance?
Just being able to stay the course in these unbelievably impossible situations. I mean, and that's true of other officers for that matter, like an Eisenhower would be an example. But it just interests me that he's in these conferences. I think of him dealing with Churchill, for example. And I think I said to you one time that I believe Churchill is like a mind of 100 years. I mean, he's just was a remarkable individual. And during the war, oftentimes Marshall was head to head with him because their strategic views, and for that matter, the strategic views of the War Plans Division, were different than Churchill's and the British.
What kind of personality did Churchill have?
Oh, my goodness. Oh, my goodness. But he was brilliant, and he was dedicated to his country, and almost in the sense, it's almost as if the citizenry of the British Isles is like his own children. I mean, his passion for what might happen to them. And, of course, in the very early days of the war, it seemed that the British might not survive. And Winston Churchill's, passion to see to it that the goals and aims of the British Isles, including defeating Hitler, were served. So when he went head-to-head with Marshall on issues of strategy, like Marshall not wanting the North African invasion, which he saw kind of as a sideshow to the desire to have that cross-channel invasion that became Normandy. I mean, I just think Churchill thought, hey, that Uniontown boy, I can have my way with him. And yet Marshall could stay the course, and he could communicate with Winston Churchill. He respected Churchill, and really after the war, they corresponded until Marshall's death. But, you know, finally, in 1944, it had been decided, a date had even been decided for D-Day. And, you know, Winston Churchill had fought to keep that from happening and wanting to have these other campaigns into Italy, into North Africa. And Winston Churchill later would always say that those campaigns in North Africa and Italy weakened the Germans, so that when you did have the cross-channel invasion, that we were successful in doing that. But, I mean, they go head-to-head on these, what Marshall calls sideshows, of this effort to cross the channel and defeat the German army. And I just feel like, you know, he probably thought, this Uniontown boy, no, I can take care of him. But he stood his ground with him, and he had the emotional stamina to stand his ground. And all of these situations dealt with the problem of, as I mentioned, scarcity. Nobody's going to get what they want, really. They're going to get portions of what they want. And yet Marshall, as this, general of the United States Army, is sitting there with a person like Churchill. And by the way, Churchill was not only the prime minister, but he also made himself the Secretary of Defense. So that when you see photographs of World War II, you see Churchill, he's sitting among all these generals. You don't see FDR sitting among all these generals. When you see him, he's sitting with other heads of state or other ambassadors or secretaries. But Churchill had this military peace that was separate and apart from being the prime minister. So he's down in the weeds of strategy constantly. And Marshall is the one who has to persuade him about the benefits of this cross-channel invasion. And he has to also persuade the Imperial General Staff and many others, but you see what I mean. Churchill is always just trying to add another little piece of action that slows down the buildup of that army, those armies in the British Isles that are going to launch that invasion. So after even a date has been set for D-Day, and Marshall is with Winston Churchill, and Marshall said that Winston Churchill would always have him for dinner, like by himself. And as Marshall said, he would put his arguments up to me. And so there's this scene where he has Marshall come, and this is in March before D-Day in June. And Churchill begins to tell him, well, why can't we divert some of these troops to the Greek island of Rhodes to get the Germans off the Greek island of Rhodes? And again, Marshall can't believe it. Like, finally, we are going to concentrate on getting everything set up for that cross-channel invasion, and he can't believe it. Churchill is talking about Rhodes again.
So he knows when to back down, but he also knows when to be assertive.
Right. And he said Winston Churchill never held it against him, but his, chief of staff Ismay had to stay up with him all night. But, something that's kind of interesting about Churchill is that Churchill absolutely did not hold grudges. That was something that was characteristic of him. People thought it meant he was fake, but apparently he wasn't. It was like, okay, I stood my ground. I argued with you. It went my way. It didn't go my way. But hey, when I see you the next time, I'm not being phony to say it's good to see you. Just an aside about Churchill.
So both Churchill and Marshall had a lot of self-security. They were very secure about who they were and not so much cared too much about what other people think if it wasn't relevant to the mission at hand.
And going back to a Churchill, again, I try to compare it to, for example, he armed his daughters with pistols. If the Nazis come, we're going to take a few out. I mean, it was so personal what was happening to the people of the British Isles. It was as if those people were his children in the most deep and emotional sense of it. And everybody felt strongly about the war and winning it and all of that. But for Churchill, it was just so very, very personal.
How did Marshall, possibly Churchill as well, how did they identify the difference between something that would contribute to the mission and something that was a distraction?
Well, Marshall, an example for Marshall had to do with what we call Operation Torch, the invasion of North Africa in November of 1942. Now, again, from the beginning, and Marshall goes to England that right after Pearl Harbor, and he's talking to Winston Churchill, and he's talking about this cross-channel invasion already. And Churchill sort of gives him the idea that, yes, we're going to do that. Because guess what? Churchill was desperate to be on good terms with the Americans because, after all, it was the Japanese that bombed Pearl Harbor. So, oh my gosh, Churchill is saying, I have got to make them believe that I'm on their side, so to speak. And so, but when he goes and he has these early conferences with Churchill, and he sort of thinks that he's got Churchill agreeing to a sort of a cross-channel operation the next spring or under certain circumstances, that's going to be the strategy of the United States. And when he gets back, it all begins to disintegrate because Churchill is really pressing for this invasion of North Africa. Yeah. And Marshall kind of believes that he's insincere, and then Churchill comes to Washington to make the case over and over again for this Operation Torch, North Africa as an intermediate operation. Yes, we're going to have the cross-channel invasion, but what we're going to do first is to weaken the German army so that by the time we have the cross-channel invasion, then we will be successful. And he really believed that. And as I mentioned, he made that case over and over again, that those North African and Italian campaigns, by the time we got to 1944, June 1944, that the German army had been considerably weakened. But that was kind of his way of rationalizing why that North African campaign could be done. Now, keep in mind that the Soviets, by the time the Germans began to attack the Soviet Union, then Stalin is looking for help on the European continent. So all of those strategic pieces are in play. But anyway, long story short, and believe me, it wasn't a short story. It was determined that it would be Torch, and that invasion of North Africa would take place in November of 1942. And one of the things that Marshall said about it, which was showed his understanding of the political realities, is that he says, he sort of uses the term, he says the American people need to be entertained. But that's not really exactly what he meant. What he meant was that we were attacked at Pearl Harbor, and in the Pacific, not only for the Americans, but for the British, everything is a loss. Virtually everything is a loss. So when are we going to do something? So that need for that offensive, even if in Marshall's view it wasn't the one that he wanted, he understood that it was a necessary thing, that the American people, Roosevelt, as the president, had to ensure the American people that we are going to do something. But interestingly, as much as Roosevelt was this political person, when it was time to organize the invasion of North Africa, the Americans' part in the invasion of North Africa, at one point Roosevelt puts his hands up as if in prayer, and he says, because it was almost time for the election, and he says, before Election Day, but as it turned out, they were not ready for that invasion, and Election Day was passed. And Marshall said Roosevelt never said a word about it. When he knew, no, it's not going to happen before Election Day, he never said a word about it. And he said of Roosevelt, he was a very strong man. And so that understanding, again, going back to this whole idea of Marshall kind of understanding constitutional guardrails and the idea that, oh my gosh, after all of the talk, isolationist talk, and FDR's talk about how we're not sending our boys into a European war, that after Pearl Harbor, and the fact that Germany, by the way, declared war on us right after Pearl Harbor, which actually in the end was to their disadvantage, you know, that the people have something to say about what has happened post Pearl Harbor. And we needed to feel like something was being done besides just surrendering.
Yeah, sounds very similar to 1776 when you had Boston Harbor in the beginning of the year, then you had New York, which was a loss. Then the Declaration came out, and then at the end of the year, Christmas time, you had the Battle of Trenton. It's like you have the win, loss, Declaration, we need another win. You got it at the end of the year. Yeah, and does that have to do with a lot of, well, does it revolve around that a society wants to see itself as the winner?
The society wants to see itself as a survivor, that this isn't going to defeat us in the most literal sense, you know. And we had this Fortress America attitude that said, well, you can't touch us. And the fact that the Japanese bombed Pearl Harbor just broke that wide open. So there was a sense of vulnerability that was even different than was typical, because we always felt like, oh, well, you know, what these Europeans are doing, what they're doing out in Asia, that doesn't have that much to do with us. And then they bombed Pearl Harbor. For example, when Marshall was working on the Marshall Plan, getting it through the Congress, now you had a Truman was the president. He had become the president after the death of this mega figure. And
this was just into FDR's fourth term.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Let's see. He died in April, 1 year. I mean, he wasn't even 1 year into his fourth term. And Truman had become the president. It's like, who's Truman? Never heard of him, you know. So Truman is the president. It's a Republican Congress. And in terms of the Marshall Plan, we're not too interested in helping out the Europeans. You know, we want, you know, a new car and buy a house in Levittown, okay? And so the idea that you could actually convince the American people that they should do what they did do in this Marshall Plan was extraordinary. But one of the things that Marshall understood, going back to these constitutional guardrails, is that the Republican senator, head of the Senate Majority Leader, was Arthur Vandenberg. And he had been this isolationist senator to the max.
Don't go into the war.
Right. Don't go into the war. Don't go into Europe. Don't have anything to, Fortress America, leave us alone. We're fine. Isolationist ideas, which were more popular with the Republican Party at that time. And yet, after Pearl Harbor, Vandenberg, he shifts over and would eventually become a very strong internationalist, because he said, if the Japanese can bomb Pearl Harbor, we are not Fortress America. And so therefore Marshall saw that wedge, because he knew in the end, and we talk about this a lot when we're teaching students, in the end, the European Recovery Program was an act of the United States Congress. So if you don't have Congress to vote on it, you're not having a Marshall Plan. And sometimes people think, oh, yeah, the State Department, the Marshall Plan. No, in the end, you're talking about an act of Congress. And one of the things that was very interesting about Marshall is that he takes his arguments about that Marshall Plan on the road. Now imagine he's the Secretary of State and he's going out on what I call the rubber chicken circuit. He's talking to Rotaries, he's talking to women's groups, he's talking to farmers, he's talking to steel makers in Pittsburgh, or to make the point that we as a country are able to do this. We have the power and we have the resources to do this. And one of the most interesting scenes of Marshall is when he's testifying before the Congress, and he says, you know far better than I do the political issues involved in this. But he says, I think we can do this, and we must do this, because he says, and he kind of uses that karate chop hand, he says, because the whole world hangs in the balance. So here you have this Secretary of State who goes out on the road. I can't think of a single other one who's ever done that. I mean, he goes to Georgia, he goes to Tennessee, and he makes the case that this is something that we can do, and that in the end it will be economically valuable to you to do it. And so he's able to go out and make this case. But the way he made that case in the United States Congress, in the United States Senate, was to work with Arthur Vandenberg. And Marshall said of Vandenberg, again, previously isolationist senator, now an internationalist, he said, I could not have worked more closely with Vandenberg unless I had sat in his lap or he had sat in mine. But you see the political acumen, really, to know I have to find an ally on the other side.
Yeah, so Marshall was a very good at identifying both the timing of things, opportunity, but also exploiting change. Exploiting the change that is advantageous to what he wants to get done without that change being forced upon someone. Yeah. Like natural change that's advantageous.
Wanting to make the case to various groups of people to help them understand the advantages to them, their particular group, like the cotton growers, who will, if Europe is in disarray, who will buy your extra bales of cotton, that idea. He was willing to help them understand the advantages of supporting something like that.
So Marshall essentially was just a great, really good compromiser. That not everyone wins, but everyone will win.
Everyone gets something. And by the way, the other thing about that Marshall Plan, which was really important, was he says in the Marshall Plan speech, he says the initiative must come from the Europeans. My goodness, you mean it's not going to be the U.S. of A. saying, oh, hello, Europe, here's what we think you need to do. The initiative had to come from them. They had to be the ones to make the case for what they needed from that Marshall Plan. And all throughout the Marshall Plan, they had to go to Paris to meet with the Marshall planners and make their case for what was needed. So if you went to, let's say, if you went to Austria today, you would find that almost any huge ski resort in Austria benefited from the Marshall Plan because tourism was a big part of their economy. So it wasn't the United States of America saying, okay, here's what we want you to do. Now, did they have to get approval for those projects? Yes, but the initiative must come from them, and they are the ones who have to make the case for the viability of their economic issues. And that was unique because, we are often sort of present ourselves as the fix-it-up chappy.
So it sounds like Marshall essentially was a great initiator.
He was. And a lot of that has to do with accepting the idea that he had to do something. So going back to being first captain, it's like, okay, I have a responsibility and I must do something. And as the Secretary of State, who had experienced World War I, and he experienced what happened at the end of World War I with the Treaty of Versailles, he understood it cannot be the same. When he's telling the soldiers at Fort Benning, you're not going to be fighting the war that we just finished. It's not going to be the same. And in a way, at the end of World War II, he's saying we have to do something different here because we learned lessons from what happened in World War I, where these countries paying reparations or paying off loans went deeper and deeper into economic abyss, and it didn't work.
That sounds really similar to Joseph Campbell's Hero's Journey, where you have your hero starts out in his world, undergoes change and everything, and then when he returns back to the world's still similar, but he's changed, and therefore he creates a new world that works better for the lessons that he learned.
Yeah, and I mean, again, and I don't want to overstate it too much, but he's a person who absolutely paid attention to what was happening around him and thought, okay, that didn't work out well. And it's very basic in a way, And it was his genius. And in a way, some people say, well, why would a person who is a military person become Secretary of State? Well, my goodness, he was so qualified to be Secretary of State by the time he got there. He really was, because of those varied experiences where he just looked around him and thought, wow, that didn't work.
Yeah, so like an oversimplified way of Marshall was that he observed, initiated, compromised, and then executed whatever it was.
And whatever he did, he believed that it was his responsibility to act, not being a hand-wringer. And, sometimes I think about what's happening today, all of the incredible crises around the world. And somebody up there is being tasked to do something about it. And, surely somebody must think to themselves, oh my gosh, I have no idea what I should do here. So that sense on Marshall's part that it may be hard, but I got to think of something here. and that he would gather the information that he could. He would talk to people, like when he went out to the field, and he did that often. When he could go out and talk to real soldiers, he loved that. And he would ask them, what do you need? What do you need? He said, and I would try to write out if they told me, we don't have any dry socks. He said, I'll get you dry socks. He says, I know you want the girls. He says, I can't supply the girls, but I can supply the socks. But it's the idea that he's looking around him and seeing what the problems are. So we're going to mention, we're going to talk about MacArthyism.
MacArthyism, or the allegations, was after the war?
In the 50s.
50s, okay. So 5, 6, okay.
It was after, China, Mao took over China, Red China. So, there's that. Who lost China, kind of a sense that somehow Marshall had something to do with that, which of course he didn't.
So what's the context around MacArthyism? Just China and just the communist takeover and such?
Well, the fact that certainly the communist takeover of China was very big. It felt very threatening to have China taken over by the communists. And even though the Soviets had been our ally and a very important ally in World War II, obviously they were emerging as our next enemy. So there was this idea that somehow there were Soviet spies that were operating in the United States and stealing secrets in the State Department and in other agencies of the government. And Joseph McCarthy was the proponent of saying that all of these people in the State Department are communists, even though he had no proof, that whole scene. And, Hollywood, they were being targeted because, after all, in Hollywood, you send out ideas through the films that you make. And there's one scene in the McCarthy hearings where Robert Taylor, who was a very famous actor at the time, he had made a film in which he said that he had a friend, a Soviet friend. And also keep in mind that in World War II, we were trying to convince Americans that the Russians were the good guys. So there were things that made that point. And now, in terms of both China and the Soviet Union, they are definitely the bad guys. So somehow McCarthy makes this point through another spokesperson in the Congress that somehow Marshall, who lost China, that somehow he has been influenced by the communists. And people, his family, they were furious at these accusations against him. And he says, at this point, if I have to prove I'm not a communist, I really don't have time to deal with it, okay? Please. And there was a situation that had to do when Eisenhower was running for the presidency, where he was going to Milwaukee, and on the stage was going to be McCarthy. And so Eisenhower had his speech, and the speech was printed out, and the speech had been given to the reporters. And in that speech, he had talked about what a great patriot Marshall was. And yet, when Ike got up to give the speech, he left that part out.
Oh.
Yeah. Well, the reporters, they were all over that. And so, especially Marshall's goddaughter and his stepdaughter, they were just furious. Oh, how could you? That is so wrong. And Marshall says, Ike just got caught up in a political situation. He says, don't worry about it. And again, if I have to prove I'm a communist, I'm not a communist, I don't have time for that. So he dismissed that whole idea, But we were trying to deal with the idea that this Soviet Union was emerging as the next superpower. And, how are we going to manage that? Especially when you think about the fact that, we thought we had this enemy called Hitler or Tojo, and yet now this huge country, this powerful country that had been our ally was now emerging as our enemy. So how did we deal with that? In the sense that somehow in this country, because we had free speech and free access to information, that there were people who were, they were influencing you in ways you might not even know. There was this idea that they're communist about. And we went through that whole decade, really, of worrying about that, and until it eased off. And Marshall just would have nothing to do with it.
So what got you interested in Marshall in the first place?
I was an American history teacher, and I retired in 1994, which is a long time ago. But, I couldn't just stop thinking about history. And my husband and I lived in Leesburg. And this house was not restored, but I found out that it had been the home of General George C. Marshall. And so I didn't know that much about Marshall. When you teach Marshall in high school, the place where you tend to stop is not so much his military career as the Marshall Plan, because when you're teaching about military issues in a survey course of American history, you're not going to spend long on, the big mega invasions of the military in World War II. It's going to be more like the cause of the war and the effects of the war, that idea. But when I understood that Marshall had lived here and that they were going to raise the money to restore this house, then I wanted to get involved, and I began to read more about Marshall in a holistic way, not just what he did in the post-war as the Secretary of State and Defense. And the more I read, the more I became interested. And so it's provided an incredibly rich opportunity for me intellectually, and I couldn't have imagined all of the wonderful experiences that I would have because of my work here. And as I mentioned, the result of all of that is still this deep admiration for the person who lived here and who would be amazed that his home is a museum.
Did you see a lot of yourself when you were researching Marshall? A lot of who you were also reflected in what you learned from Marshall?
That's an interesting question. I think that I liked his kind of straightforwardness, and I liked the fact that he was a good guy, and that's what we strive to be. And because I had been an American history teacher and had spent a lot of time talking about leaders who weren't necessarily always good guys, it was good to find one. And I often say, because in the beginning of my work here, I did a lot with working with teachers, talking to teachers about Marshall. And as I've said so many times, leaders can do great things and still be very disappointing as individuals. And also, there are people who live in your neighborhood who are very honorable and have wonderful integrity. But when you have somebody like a Marshall who exerted or acquired a great deal of power, he truly was not tempted to abuse that power. we know from reading history that people who acquire power are often tempted to abuse it. And so that was a quality that I really admired about him. And I remember when we were talking, people asked me about the fact that Marshall did not become the Supreme Allied Commander of the Normandy invasion. And, when you are a soldier, I know this from reading my history, you want to be boots on the ground. You want to be at the scene of the action. But because of Marshall's skills that he developed in the particular circumstances that he came to, that was not to be his case. And by the time the decision to name the Supreme Allied Commander of the Normandy invasion was at hand, Marshall's skills that he had learned going all the way back to Pershing and through his various roles in the interwar years, he was best where he was. And did he know that? Did he want to be the Supreme Allied Commander? I suppose in his heart of hearts he did, although he would have been on a steep learning curve, by the way, because Eisenhower had been on the scene for quite a while. But the fact is that FDR was willing to give him that role. All he had to do, as Marshall's historian said, was to open his hand. And Roosevelt asks him, what would you want? And Marshall tells him, I don't want to presume what my role should be in this war. I want you to use me in the very best way that you can to win this war. And of course, I'm paraphrasing. But then Roosevelt tells him, well, I don't think I could sleep at night with you out of the country. And Marshall writes out, he has to write a telegram to go out to Stalin to say that the Supreme Allied Commander will be Eisenhower. And the draft of that became the telegram. Marshall took that and he wrote at the bottom, "Dear Ike, I thought you might like to see this," because it names him as the Supreme Allied Commander. And Eisenhower later says that. He says, that's framed and it's in my office. But the point I want to make is that later, this reporter comes out to do a photo spread. Actually, it was a photographer who asks him this. And he says, asks him, are you disappointed that you didn't get to be Supreme Allied Commander? And you just see this little flash of temper, And Marshall says, in the face of the casualties that were to be expected in that operation, my role, in my opinion, was totally irrelevant and totally immaterial. And again, I'm paraphrasing, but you get the idea. So I think the photographer understood the answer. But there you have it in the nutshell. The mission is bigger than my own personal preferences. Do I have personal preferences? Yes. But not, he felt that, he understood, by the way, first of all, that Roosevelt was going to tell him where he was best suited. And that secondly, I think in his heart of hearts, he knew that he was in the place where he was most effective. A lot of people say, oh, he was terribly disappointed. Well, okay, I'm sure he was disappointed, in certain ways. But I think he understood also himself and saw that his strength was exactly where he was, And, we always say that this thing about Marshall understanding how the democratic republic works, that God bless democracy. I believe in it, but I suffer from it greatly. So I'm not saying he didn't suffer from it. But I think he understood that first of all, that it was the president's job to tell him where to go. And that secondly of all, he had kind of grown where he was planted.
Is that because Marshall didn't focus too much on his pride or his ego, and that a title does not necessarily reflect the value of responsibility?
One of the things that he felt about titles For example, he didn't feel the need to be a 5-star general. He said he wanted to go to the Congress with his skirts clean. He didn't want, you're giving me a 5th star. Does that mean you're expecting something from me? But also, he did not like the attribution of great things to a single individual, especially like himself.
Mm-hmm. Attribution or expectation?
Attribution, because, for example, the bill that became the European Recovery Program eventually morphed into the Marshall Plan. So, instead of using the name of the congressional bill, Marshall's Plan became eventually the Marshall Plan. Marshall didn't call it the Marshall Plan. If he did, he said the so-called Marshall Plan, because he didn't like the idea that a single individual was given credit for the work of many. And that was just absolutely core. He just did not believe that, okay, I did this all by myself. There were people who were thinking a lot during the war and afterwards about how their individual success would be noted in books. Marshall would not write a book about himself. Many generals did, and he did not condemn them for that. But he just said, my service to my country is not for sale. And he said that the honor of serving in the United States Army was recognition enough. Now, obviously, there have been a lot of biographies written about him, including mine. But, Pogue, Forrest Pogue, who wrote this 4 volumes about him, and he interviewed him right here in this room on a little tape recorder. He was convinced by others, including Truman, that if his biography was not written, that a lot of history would be lost. And so he agreed to do it. And he said, neither I or my family will profit from the sale of this biography. And he says, I won't.
It wasn't for him.
It wasn't. It was just, he was going to tell the story. There were certain things, if he couldn't be honest, he wasn't going to say it. Because, for example, Pershing, at the end of World War I, he wrote his memoirs. And he said really harsh things about some of the people who had been generals in World War I. And Marshall wasn't going to do that, but he also wasn't going to gloss it over. So he tells Pogue that, And so once again, he doesn't condemn. He states the facts as best he can. And if he can't state it in such a way that doesn't destroy somebody, he doesn't say it. It's remarkable, really. So can you tell I really like this guy?
No, I thought this sounds like a side project or something.
Right.
Yeah. All right. I don't have any other things that I was going to ask. Is there anything that you wanted to mention?
No, I just can say that it's been a very rich experience to be here. And I have been honored to do my part to advance this cause. And now, we're working with these young people, rising juniors and seniors, because in the beginning, when people came here, many of them were older people. Many of them were veterans. Yeah. There were people who came here who said, I got butter and bread at my school through the Marshall Plan, a person that came in and she was from Germany. So, you had a generation of people who really knew who Marshall was, and some who had actually benefited from him. But now, no.
Yeah.
And so going back to the value of teaching about Marshall in the school is to go back to that idea that when you find a person who did big things, big, powerful things, and yet retained his good character, and you're in a teaching situation, that's just a really nice combination that you want to point out.
What's one thing that you found that is a big disconnect between people my age and people who understood the effects of the Marshall Plan?
I don't think that the generation here in this country, I'm talking about here in this country, it's hard for them to grasp the deprivation of war. And because we do send our soldiers to war, but for many of our generation, your generation, the generation of my son, my grandsons, they have not been asked to go to war. Right. And it's hard to imagine the sacrifices of a real war. Don't get me wrong, we fought some real wars, then we've sent soldiers to those wars in post-World War II, even post-Vietnam. But it's a little bit abstract for most of this current generation. And it's hard for them to imagine that they would be asked to make that kind of sacrifice without volunteering to do it.
What's one thing that you would want to tell the younger generation that would keep them from becoming complacent of peace, of peaceful times?
Well, when you tell the story of war, when you tell the story of people who made great sacrifices to confirm a peaceful world for them to live in, it's never a done deal. It is, we can't imagine that we would be called upon. When I look at my 18-year-old grandson, who's on the cusp of his life, that he would be asked to do what American soldiers were asked to do in World War II seems unthinkable. But for this generation, because we have a lot of things, your generation has a lot of things, a lot of interesting travel, or you've got your cell phones, you've got lots of things that make you happy and that give you a rich life, which is incredibly good. And for my grandchildren and for my children, I'm glad for that. But it is never a finished thing. And that, if George Marshall were here right now, I'm telling you, he would give you that warning.
In my mind, there's not a big disconnect, but a lack of a connection between learning about history and then being able to apply that to real life, to like current day events. So what would be one thing that you would want someone who's learning about Marshall to know that they can apply to their life?
To really truly believe in this government that we live under and this country, that its history is rich, and we want to keep it. Sometimes in this country, especially when we have peace and we have a lot of prosperity, we don't think that we could ever be required to make a sacrifice to maintain that. And if we read our history, going all the way back to our revolution for that matter, there were people who literally made the sacrifice of their lives for us to maintain this government that we believe in. And I always think about Americans, that we are believers in our democracy. Now, democracies are very messy little things. And after a while, we kind of want to tidy them up, with somebody who's the fix-it-up chappy. But that democratic underpinning is deep in this culture. And if you mess with it too much, we want to get it back. But most of the time, we don't think we have to do that. We think we're just fine and everything's going to be okay. But we cannot ever, take that as a given.
Is there anything else that you wanted to talk about?
No, but I certainly have enjoyed talking to you.
Typically, I have 2 questions at the very end, which is, who do you want to be 10 years from? Who do you want to be 10 years from now, and what would you have told yourself 10 years ago? Of course, you're 85, so I don't know where you're going to be 10 years from now.
10 years from now, okay.
Better question would be, what would you have told yourself 50 years ago?
50 years ago.
Yeah.
Yeah, 50 years ago. I think when I became a teacher, I always took that as what I was going to be. I feel that being a teacher is a noble career. If you're not just phoning it in, if you're really doing that job in a serious way, you have a tremendous influence. And so to me, it's noble. They might not think so. But I always felt like I was doing an important job. And the public school is the purveyor of the concepts that we hold dear as citizens. And if you teach American history and government, you are laying down those foundations that you hope those kids will find important enough to value themselves, and that they will see that it's a beautiful thing. This country is a beautiful thing, and you want it to survive.
Cool.
Even though I may not be in it in 10 years, you see.
Well, thank you.
Thank you. It was a lot of fun.
Yeah.
You're going to be busy with that editing.
Yeah, I know.